Welcome to the Bible study. My name is Kent Philpott, and we are looking at the Gospel of John. And today we have Jesus delivered to be crucified. We're looking at John 19, verses 1 to 16. So welcome, everybody. We don't have Run TV studio to work in, so we're doing it in my little office here where we live in San Rafael, California. And so here we are presenting the passage even during these kinds of times. So we're looking at Jesus about ready to be crucified. All four Gospels, of course, record the crucifixion. John is writing to a Greco-Roman audience. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, well, maybe not necessarily Luke so much, but we find that they are writing essentially to more of a Jewish community. But John, writing in the late 80s, early 90s in the first century, writing for a Greco-Roman audience, and that's going to come up a couple of times, the significance of that. So John is doing the work of a preacher. He is an apostle. He's an evangelist. And he's presenting something that is settled and having all to do with a Jewish culture, but taking that message for a pagan Greco-Roman culture. It's important to understand the audience that John has. Okay. We're starting in the scripture now, chapter 19, beginning at verse 1. It says, Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. Some translations are going to say scourged, but this is not a scourging. This is a lighter kind of a whipping. There were three various levels. There was a light, heavier, and then there's the scourging. John, in this gospel, leaves out the scourging of Jesus. We find it in the synoptic writers, but John leaves that part out. It's interesting that all of the gospel accounts do not record the same material. They'll record different stuff sometimes. It's very interesting, and it shows the authenticity. Whenever you see the differences, to me it just points out the authenticity. So Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. Now it's interesting to ask perhaps why Pilate did that. We don't know. Verse 2, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. This crown of thorns, there was a particular kind of plant. It received a new name. I have it here. It's now called the Spina Christo, Latin, because it's the spine of Christ. It was a kind of a plant that had leaves that looked like ivy, but it had thorns, some of which could be 12 inches long. And so they twisted together the thorns, crown of thorns. It's interesting where maybe they got that. But all of a sudden this crown appears. It's almost like there had been some work had gone on earlier, but they put it on his head, and that would have been extremely painful. A lot of blood and so on. So we have the flogging, and then we have this thing on his head, and they arrayed him in a purple robe. Purple was the color that the power that be. If you were a governor, a king, a potentate of some kind, purple was the royal color. And so they're making fun of him. They're treating him badly. They're humiliating him. And it's interesting that they would do that. You have to wonder, why would they take those kinds of steps? Verse 3, they came up to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." Now, And it says, and struck him with their hands. The striking would have been hitting, probably with an open hand. The meaning of the word, as we find it in Greek, is a little elusive to pin down as to what kind of a blow this would have been. So they're mocking him. Why they're doing that, we don't know. Was that something that Pilate wanted to have done? There is some hints that Pilate was treating Jesus very poorly, hoping that maybe that would be enough, that they would say, okay, we've had enough, we'll leave him alone. There's some suggestion over the centuries and commentators that Pilate had this. We find that Pilate had a mixed emotions about Jesus. Remember the dream that Pilate's wife had. So perhaps some of this treatment that Pilate inflicted, maybe he was hoping that, okay, enough's enough. Verse 4, Pilate went out again and said to them. Now, of course, we're picking up in the middle of a situation. The people that wanted him crucified, the religious authorities, they would not come inside because they were concerned about making themselves unable to receive the Passover and the feasts that were going on for 7 days, because you didn't know if there was leaven inside of a house. They were very religious about their scruples, and so they would not come in to where Pilate was, to the inner sanctum there, where Pilate would be working. And so he had to go out to them. And he said, see, I am bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him. So again, it appears that Pilate is hoping they'd say, okay, that's good enough. We're done. So he's going to be out bloody. Blood's going to be everywhere. Dressed in this robe, having been flogged, all the things. And he says, I find no guilt in him. I think I've mentioned this before, but there are some who say that it's possible that Pilate became a Christian later on in his life. We don't know exactly whether that happened or not. Verse 5, so Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, Esse homo, behold the man. That is a Latin phrase. This S-A-E-C-C-E, homo, H-O-M-O, meaning man in Latin. There's the man. Behold the man. One commentator said that Pilate becomes an unconscious prophet at that point. We don't know what Pilate's intent was in using that particular wording, but it may have been to say, see, this poor guy, you're worried about this guy? I don't know. Verse 6, when the chief priest and the officers saw him, they cried out, crucify him, crucify him. The chief priest, notice this plural. There was a chief priest, that was Caiaphas, but of course they looked to Annas, his father-in-law, as also high priest. But there were a number of these high-level priests, people that would have been part of the Sanhedrin, of the Council of Israel. And so when the chief priests and officers, now these would have been the temple police. These wouldn't have been Romans. These are all Jewish people here. The chief priests and officers saw him. They cried out, crucify him, crucify him. They were moved to an instant kind of an anger. Sadly enough, there's a passage in the scripture where Jesus said, they know not what they do. They know not what they do. And this is the case. There's another passage of scripture that I just love. Is it says, "The God of this world has blinded the minds of those who believe not." And so we have the impact of that which is evil, including that which is demonic, present here, that are inciting these people who you would think wouldn't quite be so carried away. Jesus actually presented no real threat to them, but they're crying out, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." Now, this is the second time Pilate said this. I just can't find any reason to do this. So he says, "You do it." But they knew they could not. It has been suggested that Pilate was looking for an excuse to send his military people into that crowd and teach them a lesson. Pilate did not like these people. These people did not like Pilate. They had made a number of excursions to Rome to complain to the emperor about Pilate. They'd done that. They eventually, in 36 CE, they're going to get rid of Pilate. He's going to be fired. Pilate is also under another circumstance I think I mentioned last week. A fellow by the name of Sejanus, Sejanus, was responsible for having the emperor assign Pilate to be the governor of Judea. This Sejanus was known as a friend of Caesar. If you were good with Caesar, you were called a friend of Caesar. Caesar, of course, comes from Gaius Julius Caesar. We knew him, Julius Caesar, killed, assassinated in 44 BCE, but a friend of Caesar's. But Sejanus, just a year prior to this event, he ran afoul of Tiberius, and Tiberius had him executed. So Pilate was in a difficult situation. Take themselves, crucify him. Now, they couldn't do that. The Jewish people couldn't crucify him. They wanted him crucified. They could have stoned him. They could have had him strangled, which was their normal way of executing somebody, the Jewish people, but they wanted to crucify him. They had to have him crucified, which is the most horrible of all the deaths. The Jews answered him, these would be the leaders, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." Son of God was a term that was equivalent to Messiah or Christ. Son of God, Son of Man. They have Hebrew Bible connections and so on. Verse 8, when Pilate heard the statement, he was even more afraid. Notice that? He was even more afraid. What was he afraid of? Perhaps a panic might ensue. There could be bloodshed right there, or this could be the end of Pilate's tenure as governor. Things could happen. It could get real bad. He knew. We don't have the opportunity of hearing and seeing the mob that was there yelling, "Crucify him." But if we had, we would probably understand why Pilate was afraid. Verse 9. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, Jesus is still back there, into the headquarters. "Where are you from?" he asked him. But Jesus gave him no answer. Very peculiar. We don't know why Jesus didn't give him an answer. Although we find in, I think it's Isaiah 53, the lamb before his shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. Perhaps in fulfillment of that prophecy in Isaiah 53. Verse 10, so Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Wow. So here it is. Pilate is in his officialness, imagining that he has all this power and authority. All of those who treat their power in such a way, not going to last long. But so anyway, this is what he's saying. See, Jesus is quiet before him, and he has the power to release you, he says. But here's what Jesus says. Jesus answered him, "You have no authority over me at all." Notice, you have no authority over me at all. It's in the Greek text, unless it has been given you from above. Now, in other words, it's part of the plan. Now, if you're like me, you are having trouble understanding this. You have no authority at all over me unless it had been given you. What does that actually mean? That Pilate was placed in that place by God himself? I don't know. And as I studied the various authorities that I normally consult in preparation for a sermon, I could not find an adequate reason that was compelling enough to me to say, okay, I got it now. I understand what this is. I really don't understand it, so I have to move on. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. And that he, of course, is Caiaphas. Caiaphas knew what he was doing. Pilate didn't. So he has the greater sin. It has to do with the understanding that Caiaphas would have had, how he was threatened. Pilate really wasn't threatened by Jesus. He was just a little guy with a very scrawny little group of people behind him, and no match for the soldiers at the fortress of Antonia, and plus the extra troops that were down in Jerusalem for the Passover to ensure safety and peace. No riots broke out. So Caiaphas would be moved by jealousy, by anger at this man, whose crime was that he presented himself as the Son of God, the Son of Man, Messiah. And so they didn't like it because they didn't want. That would have if they had gone for that, that would have been the end of them. They would have lost the power. If we're gonna recognize this guy as Messiah, we're gonna say yes, we're gonna worship him, we're gonna follow him. Well, that's the end of their power structure. No more Council of Israel, no more Sanhedrin, no need for a high priest because the high priest was there. The Messiah, one of the jobs of the Messiah, he was high priest. So that would have been the end of it for them. Okay. Verse 12. From then on, Pilate sought to release him. Now, this is the third time we find these kinds of words. Pilate did not want to do this. I think it was more than just the dream that his wife had had, which he'd already had knowledge about because she told him. There's a lot more. He just couldn't bring himself to do this. So he continued to seek to have Jesus released. Commentators think that he was moved by the persona and the words and just the way Jesus conducted himself through all of this, that he had to see there was something more. He wanted to relieve Jesus, but he also had to please the Jewish authorities. He was between a proverbial rock and a hard place. So he sought to release him, but the Jews cried out. Now they realize that Pilate is wavering at this point. They cry out, "If you release this man," and that's a third-class condition. It means, and you might. If you release this man, again, and you may well do so, that's embedded in the statement, you are not Caesar's friend. And Sejanus, who is known as Caesar's friend, just had been executed, and of course that would be a reference probably to that. You are not Caesar's friend. You're in danger. If you're not Caesar's friend, bad things follow very quickly. Pilate would have instantly gotten a hold of that and understood it. Then they go on. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. They move from religious to secular politics here. Pilate was a politician. These people have become politicians. They are no longer a spiritual, religious kind of people. They have become political. And they're going to use that political power to force Pilate into crucifying Jesus. Verse 13. So when Pilate heard these words, and the idea is more than heard, when he came to terms with them, he was impacted by it. Not just the words in hearing, but he got it. He now saw the very difficult situation he was in. When he heard these words, he brought Jesus out. Now Jesus, for the first time, is out and seen now with the purple robe, the crown of thorns, has been hit plenty of times, blood everywhere. He brought Jesus out. And one of the commentators I read said that Pilate feared Tiberius more than God and truth. It's called the fear of man. What people will say about us. I remember I had to face that myself when I became a Christian. I knew darn well if I stood up for Jesus and talked about him, I was going to be in trouble with a whole lot of people. And of course I did. And I did get in that, and I knew I was going to do it because I did that same thing to other people. I did it to Christian people. I played the role of these religious people. It's not just those people. We all have that tendency. Jesus is so radical. The message of Christianity is so radical. To become a follower of Jesus, a big deal. And it goes against everything that the world values. Everything. So he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha, which has been recently excavated, by the way. It was right there at the fortress of Antonio. So here it is. So they brought Jesus out, and Pilate sat on the judgment seat, or it would be called the Bema, B-E-M-A, the Bema seat, and place called the Stone Pavement. It was where pronouncements of judgment would be made, and it gives us both the Greek, which would mean the Stone Pavement, but in Aramaic would be Gabbatha, G-A-B-B-A-T-H-A, kind of an unusual word, but of course it was in Aramaic. Very interesting point. Very interesting, I think. In the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we do not find Jesus speaking against the Roman government. He said a lot of things that would have applied to Roman people as well as Jewish people. When I say Roman people, I mean Gentiles. The world's kind of broken down into two groups, Jewish and Gentile. But Jesus never spoke a direct word against Roman government. Of course, all of the mischief and the sin and the mayhem that was caused and the brutal use of power, that was indeed, Jesus dealt with those kinds of issues, but in a generalized kind of way. But he never really did attack Caesar. He even said, render to Caesar that which is Caesar's, and to God the things that were of God. Jesus was no real threat or opponent of Rome. I'd like to make that point. Verse 14. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. The day of preparation of the Passover. Passover would have begun on sundown on Thursday, our Thursday. The Jewish calendar was different, the way they calculated things. So that Friday would start from sundown Thursday to sundown on Friday. So Passover's there. It's coming. Jesus had celebrated the Passover meal on Thursday night, but there was feasts all through. So it was that day of preparation. The great celebration, the great feast was about to begin. It says it was about the 6th hour. About the 6th hour. Commentary I read said, we've got a problem. We've got a discrepancy in the Bible, because the other gospel writers tell us that it was the 3rd hour. The 3rd hour. We've got a problem. Bible's probably not right. Shows this is all a mistake. But the 3rd hour, that's a reference to Jewish time. The 6th hour is Roman time. We find the 6th hour several times in John's Gospel. We find it in John 1:39, 4:6, and 4:6 and 4:52, and here 4 times. Uses Roman time, very clear. Then it says, he said to the Jews, behold your king. Most consider that a taunt. Behold your king. This is your king. This guy, the beat up bloody guy. Verse 15 says, they cried out, away with him, crucify him. They have really lost it at this point. They have just gone way overboard in their anger and their hatred. So I want to say something right now. The medieval church, the church in the Dark Ages, persecuted Jewish people. Totally wrong. The church had radically changed under Constantine in the early 4th century. And the medieval church, the church of the Dark Ages, persecuted the Jewish people, and that is demonic to the core. The Jewish people did not crucify Jesus. Let me make that plain. We did. We crucified Jesus. He died to take our sin away. It's just happened that the whole plan worked out with the Jewish people. So they say, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? That's a taunt. A taunt. And by the way, in the Greek it says, your king first. Your king, shall I crucify him? So that's a taunt. The chief priest answered, we have no king but Caesar. How radical. They have now denied their Jewishness, their Jewish faith. They've denied it. We have no king but Caesar. The Sadducees, the chief priests, because they owed their position of power to them. Last verse, so he delivered him over to them to be crucified. So long.